I never expected my life to change so drastically after Dad died, but sometimes fate orchestrates transformations we can never predict. Growing up, I lived with an unspoken sense of security, anchored by my father's unwavering devotion and the modest, comfortable house he called his own. That little place on the outskirts of town was more than just a building. It was our emotional stronghold, a testament to the struggles he overcame and the hopes he cherished for me. I was only 17 when he passed away suddenly, leaving me caught between heartbreak and the naive belief that my mother would protect what he had built for us. I soon learned how foolish that assumption was. As the funeral flowers wilted, she wasted no time in turning the only home I had ever known into her golden ticket for a fresh start with the new man in her life. It wasn't just a betrayal, it felt like a betrayal carved in steel, echoing through every memory I had of Dad leaning against the porch railing or showing me how to fix a loose floorboard. She sold the house without telling me, using the money to fund her new husband's questionable dream. Brett was his name, a man with no discernible ambition, except for a nebulous boat-building project that seemed more like a fantasy than a feasible venture. My mother, Linda, met him at a local bar where he regaled her with grandiose tales of sea escapades he had supposedly undertaken in his youth. How she fell for his story so quickly remains a mystery, but within weeks of Dad's funeral, she announced they were in love. I vividly remember her describing him as a swashbuckling hero, a beacon of excitement in her dull, routine life. She must have clung to those illusions tightly because when the real Brett emerged, unemployed, manipulative, and relentlessly mooching off her, she didn't just turn a blind eye, she actively enabled him. The house that Dad spent years paying off was gone in a flash, replaced by a brand new boat that Brett claimed would make them millions. It took less than a year for Brett to leave her for another woman, who reportedly had an even bigger bank account. The heartbreak she felt was overshadowed, at least for me, by the very anger I couldn't extinguish. Her betrayal wasn't a footnote in my life, it was the chapter heading. I left for college soon after, determined to carve out my own future. My grief for Dad was matched only by a burning desire to put as much distance as possible between me and the household I'd been forced to endure. During my sophomore year, word reached me that Brett had taken off, leaving Mom high and dry. She'd poured every cent from Dad's house sale into that boat, and once it was complete, Brett used it as his ticket to ingratiate himself with someone wealthier. Any pity I might have felt for her was smothered by the still bitterness that churned in my stomach. She had betrayed my father's memory and robbed me of the one piece of property that was rightfully mine. I channeled my anger into my studies, working hard to earn scholarships and part-time jobs that would keep me afloat. My phone calls to Mom dwindled until they were practically non-existent. I believed the best revenge was success, that if I became someone unstoppable, I'd never need to rely on her again. At night, I tried to bury the resentful thoughts, but they always seeped into my dreams, reminding me I had an unpaid debt of vengeance. Over the next decade, I methodically assembled a life I could be proud of. I found a job in marketing right after graduation, quickly proving myself indispensable with my work ethic. By the time I was 28, I'd moved on to a Fortune 500 company, using my skills to rise through the ranks. Promotions came with bigger responsibilities and burdens, but I carried them eagerly, motivated by the specter of everything my mother had taken from me. My coworkers saw me as a driven career woman who thrived on competition. Little did they know I was propelled by a deep-seated vow to outgrow my past. My mother's name was rarely spoken in my circle, as I refused to even acknowledge she existed unless necessary. To keep the memories at bay, I threw myself into countless projects and poured every spare minute into professional development. On the rare occasions she called, I was cordial but distant, offering no personal details. She'd briefly hint at financial troubles or a new scheme to recoup her losses, but I always steered the conversation away from her desperation. If she hoped to guilt me into helping, she was mistaken. I was done playing her game. It was 3 years ago when she finally mustered the nerve to show up at my doorstep, eyes glassy with desperation. I still recall the knock on my apartment door late one Friday night. I'd been working on a report for Monday's big meeting, half asleep in front of my laptop. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the woman standing in the hallway, her face gaunt and her hair limp, as if the weight of her own regrets had crushed all vitality out of her. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back, letting her embrace thin air. She started babbling about how she was living in a dingy motel, how she'd lost what little money she had left in a failed pyramid scheme. Apparently, Brett and his new partner were thriving somewhere in the Caribbean, posting pictures of a lavish lifestyle financed by her naivete. She said she was sorry for everything. Her voice trembled with tears, but I didn't flinch. My father's ghost loomed too large for me to feel any pity. I told her I was busy and shut the door before she could finish her plea. That night, I slept soundly, unburdened by remorse. Within a few months, I bought my first condo. It wasn't enormous, but it felt like a fortress of independence, something nobody could take away from me. Every time I walked through its door, I was reminded that I had achieved what my mother squandered: a stable home, owned through sheer hard work and careful saving. Dad's memory lingered in the little details of my decor: a framed photo of him and me at my high school graduation, the worn-out baseball glove he gave me when I was 10. Part of me thought about how proud he would be, seeing me succeed without leaning on the woman who betrayed us. I shared this space only with my golden retriever, Milo, who had a knack for sensing when I needed comfort. Most nights, I would curl up on the couch, scratching Milo behind the ears, and feel a sense of triumph. My phone would ring occasionally, displaying the same number I'd long since labeled "Do Not Answer." I kept it there, a reminder that the person on the other end once chose a con artist and a boat over the security of our family. As far as I was concerned, we were done. That illusion of finality didn't last. 2 months ago, a call from an unknown number rattled my phone at 6 in the morning. Against my better judgment, I answered, half expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. Instead, my mother's voice spilled out in panicked sobs. She needed help, she insisted, babbling incoherently about an eviction notice. Her landlord was kicking her out, and she had nowhere to go. I listened in silence, feeling a slight tremor in my hand. Whether from rage or the early hour, I couldn't tell. She finally pleaded, her voice cracking, "Can I stay with you?" I told her I'd think about it and hung up, my heart pounding with a mixture of long-forgotten anger and something dangerously close to pity. But pity was a cheap currency I refused to spend. By lunchtime, she'd left a dozen voicemails, each more desperate than the last. I sat in my office, staring at my phone like it was a coiled snake. A decade of fury and resentment had steeled me, but hearing her that vulnerable tore open wounds I thought had scarred over. I knew I had to make a choice, one that would define the rest of my life. I spent a sleepless night grappling with the morality of turning away a parent, even one who had done such harm. Yet every time I considered letting her in, I recalled Dad's face, the very quiet pride in his eyes whenever he talked about our future. The house she sold had symbolized his sacrifices, and she had reduced it to mere currency for a man who used her and discarded her. Did such a betrayal deserve compassion? By dawn, I decided that it did not, at least not in the form of free lodging, but I wasn't done with her. I wanted her to experience a fragment of the helplessness I'd felt when she snatched my security away. So I crafted a plan that was equal parts justice and cruelty, fueled by the bitterness I'd carried for years. Maybe it was wrong, and maybe it wouldn't mend anything, but it would grant me something I'd never had: closure on my own terms. As I watched the sunrise through my bedroom window, I typed a curt text: "Come to my place at noon." I didn't bother adding any warmth or reassurance. If she wanted help, she would have to face my conditions. Noon arrived, and I opened the door before she could knock. She looked even worse in the daylight, hollow cheeks, trembling hands clutching a threadbare purse. Her eyes scanned my condo's polished floors and modern furnishings, and for a second, I caught a glimpse of envy flickering across her face. Then she mumbled an awkward greeting, voice cracking with uncertainty. I didn't offer her a seat. Instead, I leaned against the wall, arms folded, letting the tension sit like a boulder between us. Finally, she broke the silence. She apologized, again, for everything: the house, Brett, the lies. I listened without a hint of forgiveness in my eyes. When she finished, her tears left little salty trails along her cheeks. Then came her plea. She wanted a roof over her head, a chance to rebuild her life. I forced myself not to laugh at the irony. Rebuild, I thought, as if her own actions hadn't demolished mine. Still, I nodded slowly, feigning consideration. Then I told her my strict condition. She could stay in the spare bedroom for 3 months, but she'd pay rent, market rate, no discounts, and she'd do absolutely every menial chore I assigned. My tone left no room for negotiation. She swallowed her pride in a single audible gulp and nodded. I led her to the spare room, a cramped space that had served as a storage area. Boxes lined the walls, and the bed was little more than a narrow cot. She set her purse down without complaint, though her expression suggested she had expected a kinder setup. Over the next few days, I enforced a regime that mirrored my own grueling schedule. She was up at dawn to walk Milo, and she had to keep the condo spotless. I left her a list of housekeeping tasks every morning, from scrubbing toilets to vacuuming rugs. And, of course, she owed me rent, which meant she needed a job. She spent her afternoons pounding the pavement, filling out applications wherever she could. By the end of the first week, she landed part-time work at a grocery store. Each evening, I inspected her chores and critiqued any imperfections. It was petty maybe, but it felt like reclaiming something I lost. She never complained openly, though I saw tears glistening in her eyes some nights. If she thought my heart would soften, she was mistaken. This was a lesson in consequences, long overdue. As the weeks passed, I discovered a dark sense of satisfaction in watching her struggle. Each time she returned from work, exhausted and weighed down by grocery bags of discounted food, I felt vindicated. I wasn't harming her physically, but I was dealing her a relentless barrage of emotional atonement. Yet, oddly, living under the same roof forced us into more contact than we'd had in years. Occasionally, she'd make a clumsy attempt at conversation, asking about my job, or Milo, or whether I was seeing anyone special. I would respond with clipped, monosyllabic answers that killed any chance of real dialogue. Still, despite my anger, I was noticing details I'd missed before. The trembling in her hands didn't always seem to stem from nerves. Her breath was sometimes labored, even when she was just sitting. I suspected some medical issue, but I refused to ask or care. She had forfeited my concern long ago. Every evening, she'd retreat to that cramped bedroom, closing the door as if stepping into a confessional. I'd hear her muffled coughing through the very thin walls and just feel nothing but the chill of my own resolve. This was the price she had to pay. One night, after a late shift at work, I came home to find her slumped on the kitchen floor. Milo was anxiously pawing at her, and she clutched her chest as though every breath was a battle. My anger told me to walk away, but a pang of dread forced me to kneel beside her. Her skin felt clammy, and her eyes were clouded with pain. She gasped for air, begging me not to call an ambulance, likely because she couldn't afford it. For a moment, I stood frozen, torn between resentment and almost forgotten compassion. Finally, I helped her onto the couch, fetched her a glass of water, and waited for the episode to pass. It took 20 agonizing minutes, during which she kept apologizing between ragged breaths. I said nothing. Once her breathing stabilized, she admitted she'd been having chest pains for months, but was too broke to see a doctor. 1,000 barbed replies teetered on my tongue, but I swallowed them. She looked so pathetic, so genuinely scared. Yet, even then, I felt no forgiveness. Instead, I felt an unsettling sense of power. After all these years, I finally held the upper hand in every way. In the following days, a very cold calculation took shape in my mind. Her health was failing, that much was clear. She might need medical attention soon, but she had no means to pay for it. The question was, did I care? A warped part of me felt that if she died under my roof, it would be the grandest vengeance of all, like a final punctuation mark on her betrayal. But then I thought about Dad. For all the anger I carried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't want me to become this callous. He'd always taught me to stand up for myself, but never to lose my humanity. And so, I reached a compromise with my conscience. I would drive her to a free clinic, offer basic support, but nothing more. No warm embraces, no heartfelt forgiveness. Just enough help to keep me from turning into a monster in my own eyes. That evening, I slipped a brochure for a nearby clinic under her door. She found it the next morning and gave me an extremely tearful thank you. I nodded, face truly impassive, heart locked. My plan was still in motion. This was merely a brief detour. At the clinic, the doctor diagnosed her with advanced heart disease. She needed medication and possible surgery, neither of which she could afford. I could see the resignation in her eyes, as if she expected me to let her die. And for one brief, horrible second, I considered it. But images of Dad stormed into my mind. His kindness, his unwavering support. I couldn't let her die and still look at myself in the mirror. So I paid for her medications, wordlessly covering the costs while she stared at me in astonishment. Gratitude wavered on her lips, but I turned away, unable to bear it. At home, she tried to thank me again, tears of relief shining in her eyes. I silenced her with a glare. This wasn't me forgiving her. This was me refusing to let hatred turn me into a version of Brett, someone who used people and then cast them aside. I still wanted her to suffer for what she did, but not at the cost of my own soul. That night, I lay awake, grappling with a swelling sense of unease. Revenge was supposed to taste sweet, but all I felt was an emptiness that gnawed at me. In the morning, I found her cleaning the living room, struggling through wheezing breaths but determined to fulfill her chores. A wave of pity washed over me, quickly replaced by the memory of how she'd sold Dad's house for a dream that crushed both of us. As her 3-month deadline approached, she timidly asked if she could stay longer, her eyes reflecting genuine fear. I looked at her, the woman who had once turned her back on everything Dad represented, and I felt the final piece of my plan crystallize. I told her she had 1 week to vacate, no extensions. Her face went slack with despair, but she nodded in silent defeat. On the final day, she packed her meager belongings, tears forming a steady stream. She thanked me for everything, even as I stood there, arms crossed, offering no comfort. When she closed the door behind her, I felt a mix of triumph and sorrow. This was the revenge I'd fantasized about for years. She was destitute, alone, and in failing health, just as she'd left me emotionally crippled so long ago. As Milo whined at the door, I whispered an apology to Dad. Then I locked it.